Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. We're going to be talking today about a somewhat sensitive topic. We're going to be talking about systemic racism, how boards can positively impact their companies and their boardrooms. And this is unique for the show. It's sort of a four-part series looking at three prominent U.S. segments of the population that have been affected both in companies and boardrooms of those companies. Our first in this series is going to look at Asian Pacific Islander segment. And joining me as my guests are Priya Cherian Huskins, who's a board member with Realty Income Corporation. Welcome, Priya.
Thank you.
And also joining us is Doug Chia, who's the president of Soundboard Governance. He's the former executive director of Corporate Governance Center for the Conference Board and is the former corporate secretary for Johnson & Johnson, and no stranger to the show. Welcome, Doug.
Thanks for having me back.
So systemic racism, is never a comfortable topic to really talk about. And yet I feel the obligation to keep the conversation going, especially if we're going to expect any change to happen. So that's the purpose of the series. It was important in this series for me to pick the right people, because I think that is the key to creating a good discussion and to truly keep, again, the conversation going. I've asked Doug and Priya because they have always been very logical thinkers, very approachable leaders in everything that I've been able to witness, and yet are very articulate to get their points across when needed. And I personally have the utmost respect and confidence that they're going to hold up their end of this conversation very well. I'm also going to refer to two studies during this series. One is called Missing Pieces Report, the 2018 Board Diversity Census, which is done in cooperation with the Alliance for Board Diversity. And also another report called The Call to Action for Equity and Inclusion in the Boardroom from an organization called the Diverse Corporate Directors Coalition. And the Asian / Pacific community was represented in both of these studies. So before I get started with my guests, I need to just take a minute and articulate my own position. It seems that people today are very curious about where influencers stand, particularly on issues like this. So while I don't believe myself to be a terribly high influencer, I do believe that the audience that we touch with this is a very influential audience. I was lucky to grow up in a family that was blind to skin color. My brother, who many call the good brother, and is a pastor, and I were raised to judge people by their character, not by the color of their skin. I sort of backed that up in my lifetime, spending a good portion of my corporate board member magazine and New York Stock Exchange career by promoting diversity in the boardroom, and I'm proud of my efforts to change boardrooms. All that said, I am not sure that I'm always fully aware of how my biases might creep into my lifestyle, and I am open to being educated on how other people see the world. Priya, Doug, that's my story, and I look forward to you opening my eyes going forward. So, with respect to the Asian Pacific community, I want to talk to you guys about sort of what the landscape is and whether you guys can sort of give examples, because often we'll see people that aren't necessarily aware of where, again, their biases creep in, but certainly they're there. When we look at the missing pieces research, it was interesting to see that the Asian community was performed much better. In fact, was when I say performed, was included in the boardroom and in senior management, but much better with technology and communications industry than it was with any others. And all others, it was really a rather poor representation. So my question to you guys again is how unaware are public companies with respect to the racial biases, particularly when we talk about the Asian community? And Doug, I'll start with you because the truth is, I really don't hear a lot about Asians as part of the inclusion discussion or conundrum. So, right there, it seems like that's the first hurdle that needs to be crossed. So, what's the landscape?
Well, I think if we look at today's discussion in the context of history, obviously today's discussion about race um, is nothing new. It's part of something that's been going on for literally hundreds of years and has reached a boiling point right now. Um, but throughout that history, where Asians fit in um, has always been somewhat misunderstood. And as a result, and as also as a result of the fact that historically there haven't been that many Asians in America, the percentage is still single digits. Um, we kind of get forgotten about. And I see right now Asians being kind of invisible um, or getting different treatments in different areas. Um, I if you look at the debates over college admissions, you have people on different sides, Asians and white folks on both sides of these issues. And it's kind of confusing in terms of where Asians are positioned. And like you said, in the tech sector, Asians are well represented. That seems to make sense. But why is it? Why are these directors not looked at as uh, really prime candidates for directorship positions in other companies? Um, there's a lot that just doesn't make a lot of sense, at least to me. But on the other hand, it does make sense when you look back in history and the patterns of the way Asians have been categorized. Um, but the fact is that the Asian experience in America is somewhat unique in terms of how we've been treated, in terms of the law over time, in terms of being excluded from the country for large portions of time, the internment camps in World War II, and various other measures that are unique to our experience.
So, Priya, it's my experience that a lot of directors, sort of, feel that, oh, I have a Asian friend, so I'm not biased, and that kind of thought process. But can you help educate on maybe not necessarily your own experiences, but maybe what you've witnessed? And also, if you could make reference to, we're mainly talking about boardrooms here, but to me, the foundational issue is senior management and the penetration of people of color into senior management, which seems like the logical stepping stone to the board in many cases. So, what's your take on the landscape?
Sure. So TK, one observation that I've made over time, at least for myself, and I think it's true for a lot of people, is that without effort, we can often end up hearing and seeing exactly what we expect to hear and see. And I'll just tell a very short story to illustrate my point. A couple years ago, I had the great pleasure of being invited to join the panel for the opening plenary session of Stanford's Directors College. That's a very famous directors education event. I was thrilled to be there. And on the morning of the panel, there were four of us. Joe Grunfest, who is the star of the panel, the moderator, and really the star of Directors College, was to my immediate left. There were two panelists to my right. And it's important for this story for you to know that I was the only woman on the panel. And just to mention it, I was wearing a super bright pink jacket, so you couldn't miss me. And it was a great panel. The topic was hot topics in corporate governance. The panel was hot. And Joe Grunfest loves to spar. The panel was there to accommodate them. And it was the kind of morning where that you can tell that the audience is really enjoying themselves as well. The panel was fully engaged. We're making great points, and it's also fun. So about 2 hours later, I was seated at a table, and I was joined by a gentleman, a public company director. He's actually well known. He sits on a lot of boards, and we know each other. We've known each other for years. And he sat down next to me, and because he's comfortable with me, which I appreciate, he started by saying to me, you know, Priya, I'm super tired of all of this diversity conversation. And then he went on to tell me what he had been enjoying about Directors College. And for him, a true highlight was the opening plenary session with Joe Grunfest. And my friend was telling me about how much he enjoyed the panel and how great it was. He was describing some of the points that had been made. And then he said to me, Priya, were you able to attend the panel? It was so good. As an audience member, it was great. Were you also able to attend the panel? So it's not really a story about me. It's a story about what can happen when we don't put effort into looking for expertise. It put effort into defeating perhaps some of our expectations. And, you know, to be clear, one thing at least I want to put out there is this idea that board members may want to look for areas of expertise and look for leaders among minorities. It's not just for the minority people, it's for the business. It's the role of a corporate director to bring that information and expertise in the boardroom so that you can have everything you need to optimize for shareholders. And in this regard, I sometimes think about the time my husband and I were traveling across the country. We were driving across the country, and we happened to intersect with the traffic going to the Sturgis Harley-Davidson bike rally. And as we were driving, we noticed that we saw a lot of bumper stickers that said, "Start to see motorcycles," which strikes you as a little weird until you actually start to see the motorcycles. And it's, again, this is about expectations. As drivers, we look for other cars. We very often don't look for the motorcycles. And yet that reminder and seeing it a handful of times on bumper stickers made my husband and I much more likely to see the motorcycles, to see more than what we expect to see.
So, Priya, thank you for sharing personal stories. And I'd love to dig deeper, but I want to get to the crux of what this show is about. And in this case, it's about how should boards change the status quo and promote true change in the organization, both in the boardroom and in management, and particularly in this case for Asian candidates, if in fact that is any different than doing it for any other segment. But again, those to me, the board can make changes, and I'd love to hear both of you talk about that. And Priya, I'll start with you on this question on what should boards be doing to make sure that they promote this change and ensure inclusion?
Well, so when I think about what boards can do, and I do want to think both about the boardroom itself as well as the leadership, the executive level that often leads to being on boards. My first thing is start to see motorcycles. And I specifically mean that if you aren't seeing qualified expert candidates, you don't want to assume they aren't there. The problem could be with the process that is delivering the candidates to you. And nothing will change without a concerted effort to look for those candidates. And I want to stress, yes, it's nice for the candidates, but it's critical for the company to ensure that it's having the very best talent in the boardroom. So that's my first. My second suggestion has to do with mentorship, but maybe with a pivot towards sponsorship, if not just full out promotion. And in this regard, TK, I think about what you have done for so many ethnic minorities and women. And just speaking to my experience, you've invited me to be on panels, to be in conversation in situations where I am engaged in my area of expertise. And this does a couple things. It makes sure that I'm in the flow of information for other public company board members. And so maybe they will see me or see others like me and recruit us to their boards. But it also is incredibly important for the next generation that is looking towards what is their career path to get into executive leadership and maybe ultimately on a public company board. It is much harder to walk that path if you don't have examples ahead of you. And TK, by promoting the kinds of people you have over a long period of time, that's the kind of example that I would put out for others, because 100% of public board members are in a position to do something similar. I think those are the two things, that sponsorship, promotion, as well as start to see motorcycles.
So, Doug, you have had interactions with the boardroom going way back. You certainly seem accelerated that at the conference board, and now you're, certainly considered a governance expert and do a lot of teachings and writings around this. So, I would think that there are things that have touched you that you could recommend that boardrooms take a look at to make sure that this does not drift back to the norm, okay? And that we actually, with this sensitivity in the public right now, that we actually take a step forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think I always look at these types of issues of, well, what have we been doing and has it actually been working? Corporate awareness raising on diversity and inclusion has been around for a while now. But it's looking like, whatever efforts have been made have not really been working. I think the board has to examine that. I also think the board needs to understand, when we talk about systemic racism, which is a big part of the discussion right now, and corporate America's role in it, the directors have to investigate how their own company is experiencing things. Um, Directors tend to get reports about aggregated statistics in terms of how many people have been hired, employee engagement scores, but they don't get kind of a real life human picture of what's going on and exactly the experience of the people who are subject to the systemic racism. And I think directors need to have some kind of interaction with employees and listen to the stories at their own companies, not just kind of think of this in a monolith. And of course, there are a lot of directors who are saying that, look, I'm really tired of this. But the fact is that it's supposed to be hard. And that just means you have to stay with it. A lot of directors have the convenience of saying, okay, well, I'm just going to turn it off for a while and go focus on, the real issues. The people who are facing this, they don't have that option. They're in the thick of it. And unless the directors are willing to put themselves out there and really, get educated on what's going on under their noses, the problems at those companies won't stop. And the companies that think they have it figured out, they don't. But I understand that, this is very threatening for the executives to essentially allow themselves to be vulnerable and for the directors to see some of the problem areas in the company. Um, but D&I training over time, to me, has looked more like a compliance exercise, and employees see D&I training as kind of the pejorative sensitivity training. Oh, now we have to do this mandatory sensitivity training module, um, because everybody has to do it. Um, and everybody knows it's really a CYA for the company. It's not about raising awareness. That's what we really have to dig into. Unfortunately, lawyers don't help because the companies, a lot of them do this because of liability issues and afraid of getting sued and class action suits over time. Um, but yeah, we need to dig in and figure out, all right, whatever we've been doing hasn't worked, and we need to essentially break it apart and put it back together again.
So, just to say it, this is a moment that we should take advantage of. One of my observations, particularly with the advent of social media, is that corporate hypocrisy will not go unchallenged. And so, to the extent that there are corporate leaders out there that think diversity and inclusion efforts and bias training are just things to do and put on a shelf, I think what we're seeing is that the rank and file employees have learned how to amplify their discontent. And so, my hope is that we are just surrounded by very sincere leadership that is interested in these issues. And again, yes, from a social justice perspective, sure, but also because it is the right thing to do for the business in terms of excellence on behalf of your shareholders. And for the few that don't understand yet, they are going to get an education either willingly or unwillingly in the form of, as I said, discontent that is amplified by social media. It's not, I actually believe that there is a benefit to this moment and to the increased awareness. And the companies that will win in this environment and the boards that will win in this environment are the ones that are going to take the moment seriously.
Yeah, and I think on that, in terms of the moment, I think what's important or what's different, what that I'm seeing this time is that the moment has opened up an opportunity for people on a broad level to talk about these issues without fear of reprisal or retribution. The fact that this particular episode of Inside America's Boardroom is happening is a result of that. You have two people who probably wouldn't be out there as kind of champions of diversity, kind of so overtly. Because a lot of executives who are minorities, they don't want to be seen as the D&I guy or something like that. You want to be seen for the entirety of what you bring to the table. But I see a lot more athletes and entertainers and others coming out and talking about their experiences in ways they didn't before, because it was almost like you're kind of afraid that there's some kind of career limiting implications of coming out and telling your story. And that just shouldn't be the case, but it has been the case.
So I want to make one comment from my experiences, and this is coming up through the corporate ranks, serving as president of a bank, and then serving on a board of directors. One of the things that I will caution board members on is, they say, "Oh, well, I'm going to go down in the ranks and find out for myself what's going on," and they'll approach people within the organization. I have found that not to be a great source of being able to understand how the people feel, because when you get to a certain level in the organization, be it president, be it a board member, and you ask somebody how's it going, typically they're not going to unload on you. Okay, they're going to say everything's good, it's nice to see you, and then as soon as they leave, they start grumbling. So there needs to be a way that a board member, whether it's focus groups that they get to observe or somehow that they can get a true picture of how these people feel, because it's my experience, and Doug, maybe it's changed a little bit, but it's my experience that in most of those cases, you can't go down as a board member and sort of find out, how somebody feels about.
Yeah, it's got to be done in kind of a way that's going to work. If a board member just walks into a facility and says, "Hey, I'm a board member, just want to see how things are going," obviously they're not going to get very honest feedback at that point. But there are ways of creating this. I also think this really highlights the importance of board composition, um, and the ability of those minority board members to actually kind of hear it in focus groups that might be in a safer space, and also for the board to learn from those own people's stories, like Priya was just talking about. There are a lot of African American directors out there who have been stopped by the cops, for no apparent reason, and have been discriminated against. So it's not this, well, this happened to George Floyd. George Floyd is not kind of a corporate director type, but it's like, look, any of the African American directors could be treated like this, and some have, and their fellow directors have to know that.
Closing statement, Priya?
Well, I think my closing statement, that seems a bit grand for what I'm about to say, is to encourage people to continue the conversation. People can feel very triggered by discussions of race, and our best shot at handling these situations is to be able to engage in honest conversation about it. And in that regard, TK, thank you for inviting me today to join you for this conversation.
Well, I want to thank you both. Again, this is, I was reluctant for the very reason that Doug spoke, to put you both in a position that, again, would in any way tarnish your great reputations of being so open and candid and working with people. I mean, you just both have a great history of that. But I appreciate this. I hope, again, this is setting the foundation for the other parts of this series. And again, thank you both for taking the time to join me today.
Thanks, TK.
Thanks again, TK.
And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.